Okay, good morning, everyone. Both of everyone who's here in person and joining us online. It's great to welcome everybody to our Solutions That Scale seminar. This is the first time we've done this in person, so we're very excited to be doing that, so welcome everybody. I wanted to mention to those of you who didn't hear this before that this is being live streamed and there are actually microphones on the ceiling that might pick up your stray comments. So don't say anything too negative about me very loudly, unless you want the world to know about it. Maybe that's what you want, which is okay. So anyway, welcome everyone. My name is James Bullock. I'm the Dean of the School of Physical Sciences, and I'm pleased to be here on behalf of the UC Irvine Solutions That Scale initiative to host this really important event. Solutions That Scale is an initiative on this campus that brings together folks from virtually every school to work towards solutions to the challenge of climate change. In particular, solutions that will scale to global proportions. We want to act not only as a convener of academics, but a convener of the community, of stakeholders, of business leaders, and community leaders. And I think with that, we couldn't be happier to be hosting Shyla Raghav today. Shyla is actually an anteater. She's an alumna of UCI. She studied applied ecology and international studies at UCI and got both her BS and her BA, that is two majors, in 2007. And she was quite instrumental, I think, in helping this campus move in the right direction on climate change, even as an undergrad. So we're really pleased to have you back. She went on to Yale after that and received a master's degree in environmental management in 2009. She's currently the VP of Climate Change for Conservation International. So Conservation International is a nonprofit organization that focuses on science, policy, and partnership with businesses, governments, and communities. She is CI's leading climate change expert and drives the organization's climate change strategy to secure and maximize nature's potential as a climate solution by leveraging technology, policy, and market innovation. This is exactly who we want to be here today. We're excited to learn from her. Many of you may know that she played an integral role in negotiations on the Paris Agreement. So this is the international agreement on climate change that was signed by 195 countries in 2016. And she has been instrumental in influencing international climate policy for over a decade. She worked at the World Bank, Adaptation Fund, United Nations Development Program, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She's been named one of InStyle's Badass Women, a Grist Top 50 Fixer, a AAAS IFTHIN Ambassador for Women in STEM, and has been featured on CNN, Vice News, and Elle Magazine. Now, I'm going to bring you up in 1 second. After Shyla's presentation, we are going to have a roundtable discussion with UCI Earth System Science Professor Steve Davis and Earth System Science PhD student Julianne DeAngelo. And they'll join the conversation, and this will then be followed by 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A with the audience. So we're really excited to host this event. Okay, and with that, Shyla, leave it to you.
I'm so honored to be here. Thank you to the entire Solutions That Scale team, James, Steve, Helen, Susie, and of course Wendell for the invitation to be here. It really feels surreal to be back here on campus. I think this is my first time returning in a professional capacity, and never did I imagine that my career would have taken me to living in Belize, in Thailand, Germany, and spending more than a decade in Washington, D.C. But that journey started right here on campus. It started with my crusade to green UC Irvine, starting with our dormitories and our labs. And it's really an honor, and I'm so humbled to be back to tell you about what I'm working on now, reflect a bit on what was achieved at the UN climate negotiations in Glasgow, and continue to absorb all of the wisdom here on campus. So I'd like you to, or invite you to start by thinking a little bit about climate change over the last 10, 15, or 20 years. Back then, Al Gore had recently launched his film, The Inconvenient Truth. I remember actually organizing a screening of that film, luring students with pizza. It was very effective. Scientists were just beginning to document the impacts of climate change. Polar bears became the iconic image for the environment. But back then, climate change felt distant in time and space. It felt like something that wouldn't really start to get bad for the next 30 or 50 years, or maybe towards the end of our lifetimes, or if we were lucky, towards the end of the century. It felt like it was us trying to prevent a problem from something bad from happening in the future to people that we didn't really know. But now we realize that climate change is personal for each and every one of us. It's here and it's now. I don't think any one day passes without us being exposed to some negative research or disturbing news about climate change. I think we're all overcome with despair and grief about the state of our planet. Wildfires and mega fires, actually, in places like Australia, here in California, to actually see the Amazon rainforest in flames, floods, droughts. And it's the people that are the most vulnerable, that are the most at risk and actually the most harmed by climate change. Think about a farmer, or think about a fisherman or woman whose entire livelihood is dependent on the climate. So one drought could mean that this farmer or this fisherman or woman could lose their entire year of earnings. One storm could destroy the only boat that this fisherman or woman has, especially as fish start to migrate into higher seas because of climate change. So change really is our new normal. Our lives, how we plan, how we develop, how we evolve as a species, is going to be shaped by how we respond to these gradual and extreme events. What we know and what we expect to see are more intense and more frequent extreme events. So in many places, what were once known as 100-year floods, so floods are occurrences that we would expect every 100 years, are now occurring every few years. Extreme heat in places like the Middle East, where we're documenting temperatures higher than 120 degrees Fahrenheit, or even in India, where I was born, where much of the population doesn't have access to electricity, let alone air conditioning. Shifting agricultural frontiers, so think about the places that are currently under production, that are being cultivated for both cash crops but also subsistence farming. My organization has had a 20-year partnership with Starbucks, and one of the shifting frontiers that we're seeing also is in coffee production. Coffee is a crop, it's a plant that likes relatively lower temperatures. So coffee is actually moving to higher elevations. And much of that land in higher elevations is just quite frankly not available for cultivation. So we're facing a situation where coffee production might actually be halved by the middle of the century. And meanwhile, all of us want more coffee, and the growing population will need more commodities and more crops and more food. And the most tragic of these impacts is actually forced migration. Many communities are unable to sustain their livelihoods, and they're forced to move, they're forced to migrate elsewhere. And we know that this is a national security issue, but it also can be a destabilizing force for a lot of countries. And so we know what's at stake, and we also know what needs to happen. We know that the cause of climate change and global warming is the emissions of greenhouse gases, the primary of which and the dominant of which is carbon dioxide, but there are also others, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. But for simplicity's sake, I'll focus mostly on carbon dioxide for this talk. Now, what we know is that the largest sources of emissions come from the energy sector, from industry, from buildings, transport. So it's really the combustion of fossil fuels of coal, oil, and gas to power our electricity grid, to fuel our fleet, transportation fleet, and also to manufacture steel and concrete. Now, what we know is that globally, we need to be at net zero emissions by 2050. So that means we need to be actually taking out more of the atmosphere after that point than is being emitted, which means we have to be at negative emissions. So essentially, there needs to be a balance of how much is being emitted and how much is being removed from the atmosphere. And you'll see that this will require a very rapid drawdown of emissions that roughly equate to a reduction of 6%, 6 to 7% every year, and at the decadal scale, halving emissions. So generally, we need to be halving emissions every decade to be on a trajectory that is compatible with net zero by 2050. Now, my work at Conservation International focuses mostly on those green wedges. So there is more carbon stored in trees, in biomass, in soil, in roots, in mycelium than in the entire atmosphere. And when we deforest, when we burn or clear natural ecosystems, and also the production of agriculture is a significant source of emissions, which is the light green wedge. But at the same time, the other thing that we know that's very important about climate change is that every 2 molecules of CO2 that is emitted, 1 is reabsorbed by the surface of the planet. That's either into our oceans or into the land carbon sink, which is in natural ecosystems. So we need to do 2 things. We need to eliminate those practices that are causing nature-based emissions, namely deforestation, and we also need to be maintaining natural carbon sinks so that we maintain the resilience and the stability of the biosphere to continue to support life, to continue to support human populations, and to continue to rebalance the emissions that are caused by human activity. And so a lot of my work is about unpacking those green wedges, actually determining what are the different pathways and how much mitigation can be achieved by each of those activities, but then also mapping all of those various pathways. Where can you achieve the biggest results in terms of climate change mitigation from the protection of tropical or boreal forests? Where are the grasslands and where are the wetlands that have the greatest benefit or store the most carbon on the planet? And then what are the types of policies and financial incentives and mechanisms that can be put in place to achieve nature's potential as a climate solution, which over the course of the next decade is about 30% of what's needed to halve emissions. So I'll pause there, and I'll now shift to talking about the global international environmental governance, and in particular, how countries are coming together to respond to the climate crisis, and in particular, develop and design the policies and the financial instruments that are needed to be on that net zero pathway. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the United Nations and the negotiations, and I think it would actually might be useful for me to backtrack to the 1990s to share some of the history and of the diplomatic and political processes that underpin these negotiations to kind of frame or contextualize what was achieved in Glasgow. So the UNFCCC stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The UNFCCC was established as one of the 3 Rio Conventions. The other 2 are on biodiversity and desertification. They were established in 1992, and since then, there have been COPs, annual COPs, which stands for Conference of the Parties to the Convention. And the first climate COP was held in 1995 and has been convening annually since, with the exception of 2020, which of course was skipped over because of COVID. Now, at these COPs, what governments and what the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, negotiate are the different types of agreements and the different types of policies that would operationalize the commitment of these countries as part of this convention. So in the 1990s, 1997 in particular, parties agreed to what was the Kyoto Protocol. It was the largest environmental treaty or climate change treaty at the time, and essentially required or prescribed emissions reductions for each country, each developed country that was party to the Kyoto Protocol. Now, there's an important principle that underpins the Kyoto Protocol, and it's CBDR. CBDR stands for Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. And the reason for the principle of CBDR is because of what this graph here shows. If you look historically since 1990, at the countries that have been responsible for the largest share of emissions, you'll see that the United States and the European Union have historically been the largest emitters. So the whole idea of CBDR is that you can't hold every country equally responsible for climate change, because carbon dioxide, we know, has a lifetime of 50 to 200 years in the atmosphere. So the warming that we're seeing today is cumulative. So every country doesn't bear the same burden or the same responsibility to remediate the effects of climate change and also help compensate those countries that were least responsible. So the whole idea of CBDR set up a paradigm within the Kyoto Protocol that separated countries into two groups, Annex 1 and non-Annex 1. Annex 1 countries are developed industrialized countries, and non-Annex 1 countries are all of the developing countries. The whole principle of the Kyoto Protocol was that developed countries, Annex 1 countries, would need to take on legally binding prescribed emissions reductions. So the developed countries that were part of the Kyoto Protocol were required to reduce their emissions 5% below 1990 levels. And developing countries had no emissions reduction requirement. The whole idea was that because developing countries need a runway, they need some time to catch up and to develop, industrialized nations should bear the burden and the responsibility of leading and compensating developing countries. The other reason for that is because, quite frankly, the poorest nations and the most vulnerable nations are the least responsible for climate change. So this graph here really just shows why CBDR was such an important principle of early climate negotiations. It really demonstrates that the countries that are on the front lines of climate change, in particular small island developing states, shouldn't be required to take a hit and bear the financial responsibility to address climate change. So the Kyoto Protocol had a commitment period between 2008 and 2012. But what happened at that time was that there was a lot of debate, especially here in the United States, about CBDR not really being fair. Because you also can't categorize China and Uganda in the same category. How could you say that China is just as responsible as a country like Rwanda or Uganda or any other developing country? There's a lot of variability also among developing countries. So the United States actually wasn't even party to the Kyoto Protocol, and it very much cast doubt on whether or not the Kyoto Protocol was legitimate. So in 2009, the COP in Copenhagen was meant to be where the successor to Kyoto would be negotiated. Presumably, it should have been a more fair policy, a fairer system that better differentiated between countries and came up with a way in which developing countries could shoulder the burden, but developing countries would also continue to be given the flexibility that they needed while recognizing that they also need to decarbonize. But Copenhagen, I'm sure many of you may have read, was an epic, utter failure. Countries left Copenhagen with no agreement. Again, because everyone dug in their heels. The developing countries wanted to maintain a non-Annex 1 and Annex 1 structure. They wanted to be given more time. Developed countries didn't want to give developing countries more time and wanted to make sure that they were holding countries like China and India accountable. So negotiations fell apart. And that's why, over the next 5 years after Copenhagen, negotiations then begun to rebuild trust and to establish a new system, a new paradigm, and a new way of organizing countries around global climate cooperation that was fair, that acknowledged historical responsibility, but also found pathways for advancing action in some of the emerging economies in the world. And so for the negotiations around the Paris Agreement, I actually had the opportunity to work with the government of the Maldives. Maldives is a small island nation in the Indian Ocean. You may have heard of the Maldives as a vacationer's dream. It's really looks like a paradise. Blue, crystal clear water, white sand beaches, but it's also one of the most vulnerable nations to climate change because the mean elevation above sea level is 4 feet, which means that with sea level rise projections and with extreme events, it is quite possible that the entire nation of the Maldives will cease to exist in our lifetimes. So countries like the Maldives have a very important role in climate negotiations because they often represent negotiating blocs like the Alliance of Small Island States and have provide a lot of diplomatic pressure in these negotiations. So I worked with the Maldives for 3 years on their negotiating team. Of course, for us, principal and most important in the Paris Agreement would be to have a requirement for developed countries to reduce their emissions by a certain level to make sure that the agreement enshrined the need to get to net zero emissions by 2050, to commit to a 1.5 degree target. There was a slogan at the time, 1.5 to stay alive, and also to make sure that there was funding for climate change adaptation. So all of the impacts of climate change that developing countries are experiencing, there was an expectation that developed countries would have helped fund some of the costs of climate adaptation. And so after 3 years of very difficult negotiations, here are some of the main outcomes of the Paris Agreement. So it ended up having to be a grand compromise because, again, because of CBDR, it was very difficult to find a system in which there could be prescriptive emissions reduction targets for each country. So what the compromise ended up being was a global goal that committed all of the signatories to a global target of limiting global mean temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius. But it didn't prescribe how to get there. And the process that then it triggered or enabled would be individual countries to establish their own targets through a process called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. It included a ratchet mechanism, which in 5-year commitment periods required countries to come back and revise their commitments. But again, it didn't prescribe how much each country needs to do. That was kind of the compromise. And there were global goals on both mitigation and adaptation. So it was largely seen as a success, also mainly because in comparison to Copenhagen, countries actually walked away with consensus, with an agreement to address climate change, but really left all of the details, or deferred a lot of the details to subsequent COPs, because the Paris Agreement was meant to enter into force in 2020. So that really provided 5 years to figure out all of the rules of the Paris Agreement. Now, the main drawback, or the main shortcoming of the Paris Agreement, again, is that even though there's a global goal, there is no line of sight into how each country collectively in aggregate will make the right type of contribution to reach a net zero by 2050. So you'll see here on this chart the comparison, or the difference in gray, which is what's needed for 1.5, and where in red, where in blue, where the NDCs, or where the aggregate of all country commitments get us. There is still a significant, what's called an emissions gap of 12 to 14 gigatons, that's billion tons of CO2. So the main drawback, or the main challenge that we have with the Paris Agreement is what are the forcing mechanisms to get countries to update, revise, and actually reflect more ambition in their collective and in their individual commitments and targets. And so that's what Glasgow was all about. Glasgow was really meant to be the final moment to finalize the rule book, to finalize all of the details about how countries cooperate and how countries would revise their commitments and their contributions to the Paris Agreement. So I'll share some of the specific outcomes from Glasgow. Those were just some photos from my time there for 2 weeks. So the first outcome was through the Glasgow Climate Pact, which basically calls on countries to update their NDCs by next year. It's accelerated timeline beyond what would have otherwise been possible. So countries actually need to show up at the next COP, which will be in Egypt at the end of 2022, with, quote, strengthened NDCs. So again, it doesn't tell countries how much they need to strengthen it, but there is a lot of diplomatic and peer pressure in the system that is expecting countries to do better by next year. So you'll already see in most countries, there is a process currently underway to determine how these countries are going to actually update their NDCs. There's also language on fossil fuels. You may have read that there was initial language to phase out fossil fuels that got watered down to phase down fossil fuels. The reason for that is CBDR. It's because a lot of countries wanted to flex their muscle. They wanted to show that it shouldn't entirely be their responsibility and wanted to maintain that negotiation leverage for the future. The second main outcome of Glasgow was related to carbon trading. So the Kyoto Protocol, one of the most unique features of the Kyoto Protocol was the ability of countries to actually trade emissions units. So developed countries had the option of financing clean energy or clean tech projects in developing countries and then claim credit for that emissions reduction against their own emission reduction target. And that helped stimulate a lot of investment in developing countries. Of course, it was not a perfect system, but there is an expectation that there would be a market as part of the Paris Agreement as well, but all of the rules were not decided. So one of the main outcomes of Glasgow was that there was agreement that if two countries cooperate to trade emissions reduction units, there has to be a cancellation of those units from the host country. And that helps ensure that there is integrity in the market and that you don't have double counting. Because if you have one company and one country or two countries claiming credit for the same unit, it undermines the legitimacy of the entire market. So this was a very, very important outcome and will help ensure that these markets have the right rule sets in place. And then there are two other relevant outcomes that I'll just quickly mention. One is recognition of this concept of loss and damage. This is a legal term where a lot of developing countries that are experiencing losses and damages from the impacts of climate change expect financial compensation from those that are historically responsible for climate change. So think about a country like the Maldives would expect some resources to build back or perhaps engineer higher sea banks or seawalls, or a country that experiences a severe drought may expect some financial compensation to retrain farmers or to introduce drought-tolerant seed. But the tricky part about the negotiations on loss and damage is that some oil-producing countries also think that they're eligible for loss and damage. Because if the future economy is decarbonized, then an oil-producing country will have to find a new source of revenue, will have to find a new economy. So many oil-producing countries also are expecting compensation. So you can imagine why the negotiations in this whole stream are so wrought and so difficult. One, because how do you attribute responsibility? How do you attribute historical responsibility and determine what that payout should look like? And then also, who is eligible? Could a country like Saudi Arabia be eligible for loss and damage payments from the United States? So these are very, very tricky negotiations, but at the same time, it was very encouraging to see a kind of global recognition of the importance of loss and damage. And then lastly, most directly related to the work that I do, there was really an unprecedented recognition for the importance of nature as a climate solution. And I was actually part of one of the major announcements that was made in Glasgow. So the amount of financing, perverse subsidies that are going into the destruction of nature are 40 times higher than funding for conservation. So there are trillions of dollars that are funding agricultural companies and are incentivizing deforestation. So unless we redirect that financing towards a green economy, it will be very difficult for us to rebalance that equation and to make conservation more profitable than the destruction of the planet. And so we worked with 30 financial institutions and got commitments for more than $9 trillion of assets under management to commit to stop funding deforestation. It was really game-changing and really consequential. And now more than 90% of all global assets are covered under some sort of net zero target. Of course, the devil is going to be in the details. It's going to be in the implementation of those commitments, on the integration of those commitments with one another, but also the accountability mechanisms to make sure that we're watching, that we're tracking progress against those targets, and we make sure that those that have made the commitments in Glasgow are actually making good on what they said they would do. And so working for a government like the Maldives really underscored for me the importance of justice and resilience in the climate movement. It's really been very impactful for me to be able to work with local communities, to work with communities on fair, just, inclusive solutions, to not hold up those with financial resources as the saviors, but rather with respect, acknowledgement, co-create those solutions with communities. We know what needs to happen. Many of these solutions are no-brainers, but it's not just about doing less bad. It's also about replacing an economy that's dependent on extraction and exploitation with one that's regenerative, with one that's restorative. And the youth climate movement has really revived environmentalism and action on climate change, but it's also shown us that we're not doing enough. I will be the first to admit that what we achieved in Glasgow was grossly insufficient compared to the challenge. But COP is just one of many avenues for impact and for change. And COP26, I think, helped establish the direction of travel, but it will be up to all of us, our cities, our states, our communities, companies that we work at, to set the speed of travel. So thank you so much. I look forward to a dialogue and discussion with all of you and working with all of you at the local level. Thank you.
We'll join you here up front to have a conversation just 1 second here. But as we do that, I'd like to invite Steve and Julianne to join us, and I'll introduce them briefly. Professor Steve Davis and PhD student Julianne D'Angelo are both in the Department of Earth System Science here at UC Irvine. Professor Davis is an IPCC contributing author. He's a fellow of the American Geophysical Union. He's officially recognized as one of the most highly cited researchers in the world, and a co-founder and chief scientist of Near Zero, which provides expert solutions for climate change mitigation. His research focuses on understanding the complex interactions of human and natural systems in order to assess causes and magnitudes of damages into the future and now, and to identify possible solutions. And Julianne D'Angelo has been a PhD student in ESS, working with Steve since 2019. She has a background in physical Earth climate, and now her broad research interest is in assessing scalable decarbonization strategies that are both economically viable and policy relevant. So I'll come join the conversation, and maybe we can be seated. And we'll talk among ourselves just a little bit, and then we'll open it up to questions. I also have some questions that have been submitted prior to the talk, so I can ask some of those as we go on. So, Steve, why don't I ask you to kick us off here? You want to start with the question?
Yeah, I guess first off, I'd just like to thank Shyla for such a terrific overview of the long-term trajectory of these negotiations that I really enjoyed your take on. I think one thing that I wanted to maybe ask you in particular, given where you work now, is increasingly there's been some criticism of the idea of net zero as opposed to an actual zero target. And in your slide of the different wedges, for example, you can see in that the green bar above zero, the sources from nature, is smaller even in the long term than the green bar from the uptake. So you're counting on nature not only to negate the sources that we have from nature, but to actually compensate for some ongoing emissions from human activities. And I wondered if how that squares with you, if this is a concern. Do you think it gives a pass to energy sources or industry to keep on emitting and look to nature to make up the gap?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's such an important question. It's one that has sparked a lot of active debate within our community, because there's a fear that carbon offsets and carbon markets give polluters a free pass, a get out of jail free pass, let them off the hook, allow them to pay for solving a problem in another place without actually decarbonizing their own operations and their own business. So, but at the same time, if you look at the other side of the coin, there's not enough funding that is protecting forests, and we are really at risk of reaching a tipping point where the Amazon might become a savanna, or we might completely, natural ecosystems would lose their ability to keep sequestering the same amount of carbon that they have been in the past. So if you ask many conservationists, $1 more for conservation is $1 more for conservation, regardless of where it comes from. And so a few of the areas that we've been working on are carbon market integrity standards. So looking, for lack of a better way of describing it, on the demand side and supply side, having very clear integrity rules. So on the demand side, making sure that any entity, any company that is using offsets or participating in offset markets are doing so in addition to decarbonization that's compatible with a net zero trajectory. So it shouldn't replace any credible decarbonization, it should only accelerate their decarbonization. So there are very good standards that are now being developed that can help benchmark companies against those, but also having integrity standards on the supply side to make sure that you're not establishing plantations or monocultures and claiming credit for those types of activities, and also ensuring that the markets are stimulating widespread conservation at scale. So I would say that it is a solvable problem. Markets can help bring much needed funding to solutions, but it needs to be done carefully, and we need guardrails in place.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you.
Julianne, let me ask you to sort of chime in here. Do you have any questions or responses or thoughts on these discussions?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the discussion about emissions offsets versus residual emissions. So Steve and I recently did some work looking at the emissions scenarios and mitigation scenarios that are used by the IPCC and looking at what they look like in terms of their energy system when they reach the point of net zero emissions. And one of the things that we found was that the residual emissions and the negative emissions offsets were not equally distributed across world regions. And I was just wondering if you think that that's reflected in the current commitments and policies, and if you're concerned about that some regions might be bearing the brunt of the responsibility for those emissions offsets, and whether you think that the markets that we're talking about can help address that.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think there's a lot of variability, especially when it comes to forest-based offsets. And there's a fundamental problem also in carbon markets because they function on a concept of additionality. So for kind of an area or a landscape to be eligible for carbon credits, there needs to be an existing deforestation rate, because otherwise you can't claim credit for any emissions reduction if they're under a business as usual scenario. That deforestation wouldn't have continued. So there are many areas in the heart of the Amazon, or even countries like Suriname or Guyana, that have very low deforestation rates and don't stand to benefit from carbon markets. They're basically being punished for not cutting down their forests. So we're also working on trying to reimagine carbon markets in a way that can perhaps pay certain countries for the maintenance of carbon stocks rather than only paying for the avoidance of a loss. So that's one piece. But there is also concern that there will be a flood in the market of credits from forests that would reduce the price so low that it wouldn't make these projects financially viable and would disincentivize technological innovation in other sectors. So these are all issues that would need to be resolved. Now that we have rules on Article 6, I think it's ripe for having good science and information that can help distribute the benefits and the costs and the payments from these markets.
Great, thank you.
This is fascinating. So I'm going to ask a question now, and then what we're going to do is go to the audience, and then I'll read some questions that other people have submitted. And then I feel like any of our three panelists can kind of answer these questions so we can really get a good dialogue going. So let me preface this. I'm going to put my dean hat on here for 1 second and say, you know, at UCI, we're extremely proud of our legacy in this space around climate change and climate change solutions. Not only do we have the first Earth System Science department in the world that I think has been a trendsetter now, and there's many departments like it now that have sprouted up, but we lead in terms of walking the talk here on campus, thanks to the efforts of people like Wendell and you, even when you were an undergrad. We're really proud of what we're doing. We're sitting in a building that's a LEED Platinum building, and we try to do the right thing, not only on the research side, but on the sort of living side. But more broadly, I think we want to do more. And to you, I ask, what do you think should be the role or could be the role of a university like UCI in helping towards solutions and really helping the world get on the right track here?
Yeah. Thank you. I know we spoke briefly about this yesterday. I think that there's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of technology, a lot of science that is insulated within the kind of academic sphere. There are so many practical applications of that science that either could help the countries that are establishing their targets, but more importantly, help them identify the policies and the levers and the tools that can unlock vast amounts of mitigation and adaptation. But also in democratizing access to finance. A lot of these multilateral systems channel funding from the top down, from national governments down, which is very inefficient. And it's very difficult to actually get funding where it's needed to local communities. And so I think there's a key role for technology to help accelerate and streamline processes of providing payments to local landowners, or helping to validate outcomes so that local communities can demonstrate conservation outcomes or specific outcomes as a basis for accessing these markets. There was about $19 billion of funding committed from national governments, $2 billion to indigenous communities, with no line of sight as to how that's actually going to reach local communities. So I think really having that intersectional service of helping to connect the technology to practical real-world problems and monitoring those outcomes and validating those outcomes could be game-changing, especially when it comes to carbon markets.
Well, okay, so that's fantastic, and we'll keep talking more about that. And of course, another place I think that a university like ours, I think contributes is the fact that we just have all these amazing students on campus. You were one of them at one point, and I think we got a bunch of them today, probably some in the audience, some online. And so that's one of the reasons why I really want to open this up to questions. We want to hear from folks who are here, we want to hear from students who are online, et cetera. So why don't we do this a little bit? I think we have a couple of students here going to help us with microphones. Does anyone in the audience right now have a question or comment about anything related to the topic today? Yeah, you sir.
Yes, I have a question. So, hello, I'm a fellow student here in UCI, and a question I like to ask, because as you are aware, of COP26. But one thing, you have left out is that COP26 has faced criticism for being very exclusive event, especially for, not bringing in people, marginalized, communities, not bringing in, both in the global north and the global south. And there has been some fair share, of criticism, especially, people not listening to these types of voices, whether it be, or even within global north, the African American, the Latinos, indigenous voices, and also the global south for those who are most severely affected. So one thing I like to ask is that how do we make sure that in order to correctly tackle the climate crisis, how can we at least make sure that there is, equal representation from those who we don't hear their voices very often?
Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I can start, but would love to have your feedback as well. So in terms of the international negotiations, I think we've come a long way. In the days of the Kyoto Protocol, it was almost exclusively a government process. So there are what called accredited observers. So there are organizations that get accredited by the UN and then get an allocation of 2, 3. My organization, for example, gets about 10 badges for every COP, so we can send 10 people. And so there are different types of participants in this process, and usually it's just the governments that have access to negotiations rooms. Now, ever since Paris, there's been a little bit of a shift. There's been more of a sense that this needs to be more than just a government-led process, because a government doesn't necessarily feel confident or comfortable to make a commitment if it knows that the companies in its government are not on board. So one of the reasons that Paris actually was successful was because hundreds of companies set targets and made commitments in 2014. So there's now been more of an effort to integrate the private sector into COPs, but you're absolutely right. There's still a long way to go to ensure that youth voices, indigenous, underrepresented, marginalized voices have a seat at the table. Now, I will say my organization sponsored about 5 indigenous representatives, and we do every year. There's a number of civil society organizations that are ensuring that there is access to these rooms, but the problem is there's no formal seat at the table because the seats at the table are all occupied by governments. So one of the ways that we're working on addressing that is through a process called the Indigenous Peoples Knowledge Platform. So it's a formal negotiation process that includes Indigenous knowledge, but also making sure that there's pressure in national governments and basically kind of complementing the COP process with other mechanisms, forcing mechanisms to integrate into the system. So I will say that there is still a long way to go, but we have made a lot of progress. And I will say that there were 40,000 people in Glasgow, and a lot of them were civil society, a lot of them were protesting, and I think it had an impact on the outcome.
Thanks. We got, is that Barbara? I think.
Behind the mask. So, Barbara Finlayson-Pitts from chemistry, student a long time ago.
Here comes a mic. Here comes a mic.
Yeah. So, Barbara Finlayson-Pitts from chemistry, student a long time ago. I think of the CFC's issue, and of course being on campus here with Sherry and Mario, having gotten the Nobel Prize for that. And I look at what happened to that over the years, because a lot of the same issues were there, that the developing countries didn't have refrigerators and air conditioners and so on, and the developed countries were responsible mainly for this, and the developing countries said, why should we be denied these sorts of things when you guys are the ones who screwed it up? And if you look at the, starting with the Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol and all the amendments since, it's been really successful. Now, there is a difference, right, in that it was mainly DuPont's ox that was being gored, as opposed to all of us having to change the way we live. But I'm wondering if there are discussions about lessons learned from that in terms of how you accommodate both the developing countries' concerns and lack of their contribution to this problem versus the developed countries.
Yes. So absolutely, that's such an astute observation in terms of the comparison between the Montreal Protocol and climate change. And we know that there's a Kigali Amendment, there's been, and I think the main fundamental difference between CFCs and climate change is that the alternatives were very clear to and very easy to identify early on. But also there was really a clear pathway for tech transfer and for developed countries to be able to provide developing countries with the technologies and with the equipment to be able to retrofit and replace the ozone depleting substances that were currently under production. And so I think the reason the Kyoto Protocol failed is because it tried the same model and it fundamentally didn't work, because similar to what I was reflecting on earlier, it's not developed or developing. There's a lot of variability, and it's also carbon is driving is the economic engine of every single country on the world. And so there's no kind of switch to just replace one gas or replace one type of equipment. It requires retooling our entire economy and how we organize society. So that substitution wasn't exactly there. So I think the lessons learned are that you need to have flexibility, which is what I think was accomplished in the Paris Agreement. But I think where we've fallen short is on the provision of financing, because the financing has really just been a patchwork. And it's also oftentimes been recycled funding. It hasn't been new funding, or it's been loan, concessional financing. It hasn't been grants or actual provision of new technologies. So I think that's where there needs to be a greater respect for justice and greater respect for actually making good on those financial commitments, which I think would help restore also the trust, the mistrust between countries.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm Dan Stokels from School of Social Ecology and Public Health. And thank you, Shyla, for a great overview talk. My question has to do with the asymmetry of emissions by certain corporations and even certain government leaders. For example, the situation in Brazil with the Amazon forest being burned. And there's increasing discussion in some legal quarters about prosecuting the crime of ecocide. And I'm wondering if there's been much discussion within the framework of the Paris Agreement or Glasgow about targeting some of these asymmetric high-impact emitters that are destroying environmental resources with the knowledge that that's what they're doing. A lot of people do things that hurt the environment unintentionally or without knowledge, but some actually know what they're doing, but for profit motives or ideological motives or whatever, they continue. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about incorporating those kinds of legal strategies into this overall package of strategies to get to net zero.
Thank you for the question. I'm actually good friends with the founders of Stop Ecocide Law, and they had a number of really inspiring events in Glasgow, and I think the concept in particular is just gaining so much traction. I think the challenge is actually getting, because the UN process requires consensus, you can imagine any one country can block an agreement. It doesn't necessarily, no country has veto power. Every country needs to agree. So that's why you often see a very diluted or least common denominator outcome of these negotiations, because it's really difficult to reach a level of ambition that's required when you have certain countries that don't want reference to human rights or don't want to be held accountable directly through decision text. But I will say that there has been, and also the shortcoming of the UN system and even of these pacts is that there's no enforcement mechanism. So even the Paris Agreement, if a country sets forth a commitment and doesn't meet that commitment, what's the recourse? It's basically just diplomatic pressure or diplomatic censure. That is the extent of the recourse or the kind of the mechanism that would be used to hold a government accountable. So I think that's why civil society is going to be so important, because the UN is not going to hold countries accountable. It's us. It's individuals, it's citizens who need to vote politicians in and out of power consistent with our values, because we're not gonna get that type of litigation, at least through the UNFCCC process. Now, there might be something in the International Court of Justice or other vehicles that I know the groups are exploring that I think hold a lot of promise. But I'm gonna hold my breath when it comes to the UNFCCC, because it's really, I think, not set up to kind of have that level of ambition integrated.
Thank you.
So we got one question here, and then I'm going to jump in with a question that was submitted. Go ahead. And then I'm going to jump in with a couple questions that were submitted earlier.
Hi, my name is Jen. I'm in the Earth System Science Department, and my question is regarding carbon offsets and like the UC net neutrality and kind of like this idea of like accountability. So I saw a documentary recently made by some students at UCSD regarding the UC net neutrality, kind of like their goals. And basically the UC buys offsets to kind of reach that net neutrality goal. But from the documentary, they talked about methane, the use of natural gas basically to provide energy for the UC system, and that has not changed. And so kind of what we were talking about earlier, or what you were talking about earlier about how offsets should accelerate the decarbonization, but in this case it's not being accelerated, it's just being used to kind of what Steve was addressing in his question earlier, as like an excuse to kind of say we're net neutral, but not accelerating that decarbonization. So I guess like how can we, since we need to like think about it at like the local, regional levels, and then like apply it to the global scale. Like if the UC can't do it itself, then how can we expect it to be done at the global scale?
Let me interject briefly before you. UCI wants to do this the right way, and Wendell and many others here could talk about our efforts to really go true zero and not necessarily net zero. But that's another discussion. I'll hand it to all three of you to respond to this. A great question, really important question. Sorry, Steve. There you go.
No, I mean, this is something that we've actually been having lots of conversations now going on 5 or 6 years, and there's been some reports about exactly what you said, Jen, that natural gas burned on our campuses is the major source of UC emissions, and how do we get rid of these sources? And there's different ways to do that, and I think there's actually good arguments for doing it different ways. One thing to say about these plants is that they're actually some of the cleanest and most efficient power plants there are. So if you're actually looking at the global scale, where do you want to get rid of emissions? You want to go to the dirtiest coal-fired power plant in the world and shut that one down first, and ours wouldn't be in line then for a long time. But on the other hand, they're on our campus, they're physically under our control, and so there's a good argument to say we should get rid of those and try to move to something else. But it's a longer conversation, but I think that all the players really have the same interest in mind of doing something that can be replicated globally and will really make a difference. So I think maybe I'll leave it at that for now. I can put you some reports and things if you want them.
Anything else to add? Okay. So we've got a few questions here, and I'm going to start. Maybe the three of you, I'll ask you each to briefly answer this, because this was the very first one, and the question is just, is there hope? Question mark. That's it. That's just the question. Is there hope? And I do think that there are a lot of people who are wondering, what are we even doing here? Is all hope lost? How should we be thinking about this in an optimistic way, or should we? Are you hopeful, and what is the hope? And I'll ask each of you to sort of respond for the way you're thinking about things right now in this space. So, whoever wants to go first.
I think that there absolutely is hope, and there needs to be hope. I think that the discussion around thresholds and limiting warming to certain amounts is important in the context of holding countries accountable and creating policy that really pushes us to make these transitions in our energy system and in other systems as well, like agriculture. But I think that sometimes it takes away from the idea that every bit matters, that it's still worth pursuing things that maybe lower that a little bit, get us closer to that 1.5 degree goal, and the idea that it seems so unattainable and so far off, I think really discourages some people from trying at all. But every little bit that we do matters, and so I think that framing it in that sense can be helpful and be less kind of doomsday-ish surrounding these topics. And then if you want to add to that, Steve, I know we've had some discussions on these topics.
Yeah, I think, James and I have actually had some conversations too that oddly, I think a lot of the people that work in this space are more optimistic now than they have been in a long time, despite the fact that, in the public's view, these climate change impacts are really starting to manifest and people are becoming, despairing, as Shyla mentioned. And I think the reasons that I'm personally optimistic is that we've seen such tremendous progress in the costs of some of the solutions. They're coming down. Solar and wind are now often the cheapest sources of electricity in a lot of places. Electric vehicles are really starting to penetrate the marketplace. Battery costs are coming down exponentially. So there's lots of causes for optimism that we're going to be able to phase out some of the worst sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that's a really positive thing that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I would echo the same sentiment. I think getting to work every day with local communities, seeing the resilience of both at the community level, but at the individual level, learning about traditional practices and traditional knowledge that I think can give us so much of what we need to repair our broken connection with the planet. And ultimately, the planet is telling us something. It's telling us that we've lost that connection with one another and with nature. And so I think it's a cue, and I'm hopeful that we will all take that cue and we'll learn something about ourselves, and we'll use this to stimulate something that will nurture not only ourselves but the planet as well.
Thanks so much. One thing I would just add, I think one of the things that's kind of interesting about sort of hope and threading that line with fear or worry is understanding. And I think understanding the basic science behind what's going on actually can go a long way towards recognizing that it's not hopeless. These are physical processes that obey the laws of physics. We understand how we got here, and we understand how you can change things. And it's not, you don't have to defy the laws of physics to fix things. And that is a fact. And so I don't think we should be hopeful just for that reason alone, right? It's certainly possible. There are a lot of things that are harder, but I think we worry about doing all the time. We did get a couple of questions that maybe this is more for you, Shyla, but is your organization or anyone you know hiring? How do you recommend recent graduates get involved in climate justice field and climate change efforts? How did you get to COP26, and are there opportunities for students here at UCI to get into next year's COP? Kind of a broad range of kind of questions.
Yeah, Yeah, great. Well, the next year's COP is in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, so it will very much be focused on issues related to Africa. So usually the host government has a significant influence on the agenda and the political pressure. I mean, as you probably saw, the UK government expended a lot of diplomatic pressure to try to make Glasgow a success. So the next COP is really going to focus, I think, a lot of issues on restoration, on equity and justice. So I think it's ripe for participation. Of course, I think finding the right entry point in terms of which organization's accredited, I'm almost confident the UC system should have some sort of accreditation with the UN. If not, I'm happy to help with that process. But in terms of my own journey in attending these COPs, my first COP was COP 13. I attended in grad school, so it's very much possible for students to attend. You can either support an organization like mine and we'll accredit you, and you can go help us take notes, or help us write pieces, or help us reach out to key stakeholders there at the COP on the ground, help us organize events. You can also try to help a government. Governments will often accredit observers or advisors, like I was with the Maldives. So if you have a good relationship with the national government, or you're doing some field work, that also might be an opportunity. But I would say focus on issues related to entrepreneurship, on innovation, and on restoration. Those are going to be hot topics for COP27 in Egypt.
Thanks. Before I ask any more of the questions that were submitted, anyone else in the room have anything they want to ask? Okay. So here we have one which I guess goes to a little bit more maybe what you're working on directly, but maybe with some more specifics. It says, how do you see the role for biology, I guess this is sort of natural sources, as a solution? Carbon capture from plants and soil and seaweed, etc. What are the best hopes in that space, and what do we need to know about that?
Yeah, I would say the lowest hanging fruit, and I can send everyone some research that was just published last week on a concept called irrecoverability. So it's basically mapping all of the ecosystems on the planet that store so much carbon that if we lose the carbon in that ecosystem, it can't be replanted or recovered or restored on any human relevant timescale. So think about mangroves, which are coastal forests or peatlands. Most of the carbon stored in those ecosystems goes almost 20 feet below ground. It's stored in organic matter, and it's stored in the soil itself. And so once peatlands are drained, or once mangroves are cleared for aquaculture or for coastal development, much of that carbon is emitted, and it can't be packed back into that ecosystem even if you replant trees or you try to recover it. And so we now have a map of where these places are, and it's a blueprint for the places that we need to accelerate and fast track the protection of. And this is groundbreaking science. It's really exciting because for our organization, we've worked on biodiversity in the past, and the concept of biodiversity hotspots was something that came out of our organization. And now we have climate hotspots, if you will. So that's one of the main areas that we work on, is kind of mapping natural ecosystems and tracking in real time rates of carbon storage and sequestration, and then helping get that information to policy and decision makers so that they have the incentives to keep those places intact.
Great. That's really anything to add from panel on that?
I don't think so, but I might have a question. I don't know if it's okay if I interject.
Yes.
I guess I was just struck that a lot of the answers that you've given today, Shyla, and I know your background here at UCI had this very interdisciplinary flavor where you had this sort of grounding in science, but you were also studying how we make these rules, how do we negotiate these diplomatic interactions in the case of COP. So you talked today about guardrails and how much residual emissions are consistent with our future climate goals and things. It occurs to me that a lot of those are not fundamental science, physics questions. They're actually like, how do we make these rules? How do we make them fairly? How do we implement those? I wonder if you have any just overarching advice for the audience about how they could, play an important role in this. Like, studying science is obviously important, but having these other dimensions to your education and your experience seem really vital right now. And I don't know if you have comments about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I got some advice early on in my career that really helped shape how I look at solutions and how I look at my work. So for anything that you're working on, if you're trying to work on some sort of behavior change, you always need a line of sight to two things. One is who's the doer, so whose behavior is it that you are trying to change? And two, who is the payer? And oftentimes in conservation, we'll work on 5-year grants and we'll provide resources to communities, and once those resources dry up, then it almost reverses all of the outcomes or advantages or benefits of that project because it's not sustained or maintained or not integrated into the economic system. So it's always really important to know those two things, the doer and the payer, and connecting everything that you're doing back to those, kind of keeping those in the back of your mind has really helped me to make sure that I'm not creating information for information's sake or just a pet project, but rather I'm pursuing knowledge in service of some sort of problem that can be solved by identifying those two key pieces of information that I think are critical to having impact at scale.
Oh, that's very cool. I don't think I'd heard that before. Thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Other questions? I mean, I'm struck by that because I wonder, so that's sort of for, you were sort of speaking towards, I think, maybe students who are thinking about working in that way. How do you think, I'm just imagining, Steve writes a paper, it goes to Nature, a very visible journal among scientists, and then all 15 of his colleagues read that paper. I'm joking, but
I don't know.
maybe 10. Maybe. If you're an organization that's trying to figure out what to do, I'm sure there are people in your organization, you probably read the literature and then try to communicate that. But are there more effective ways that, if academic makes a discovery or has a finding, what are the most effective ways that sort of discoveries can then be sort of communicated to the broader community of people who are actually making decisions?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And as an organization that's science-based, we also try to be deliberate about any of the science that's coming out of our organization, go through a process. So typically we will always write a policy brief, some sort of translational piece in plain English, no offense, that actually translates the implications of the findings in that paper for a particular decision context that very clearly spells out recommendations. And it often takes some conversation, some iteration to get at what those recommendations are so that they're actually impactful, they're actionable recommendations and not just, do more mitigation or provide more funding, right? Because those have it's very easy, those are the obvious recommendations. How do you actually provide something meaningful and additional to what's already out there? So definitely having policy briefs, having reports with good figures. You'll see I use a lot of infographic type of materials, so having good visualizations of data also helps. I will say we do a lot of briefings as well. So we'll identify key stakeholders or constituencies. So it would be, sometimes it's not the CEO you're trying to reach all of the technical officers or the chief financial officer. Or it might be, all of the planning commission of a country. So identifying who are the doers, who are the people whose behavior you are trying to influence, and then directing briefings, webinars, conversations, workshops. Of course, pre-COVID, we would often go and visit, spend a week with government officials and unpack those findings with them and make sure that it's durable for them, because oftentimes what we'll do is we'll also give information and they can't use it because it's not part of their GIS or their data system. So also meet them where they are, right? Give them information in the form that they need to integrate it into their own decision support tools.
Right. Oh, great.
Could I just follow up really quick on that? I think that's fascinating, and I guess what I'm thinking about as you're explaining that is the skill set to translate, to write that policy brief, or to know what the actionable thing is for some decision maker is a different skill set maybe than the person who can calculate how much irrecoverable carbon there is. So I'm wondering, is that something that's learned on the job, or do you have different experts that come in and sort of interview the scientists to get at that, or is it in the mind of one person like yourself, or how does that process go and who's involved, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that that's kind of the function that I typically have in my organization, is kind of providing that translational service and role. I would say there's few. people that are trained to do that. And I think the roots of that was here at UC Irvine. My applied ecology degree forced me to apply the science that I was learning. So I would encourage as many interdisciplinary degrees and the pursuit of interdisciplinary, degree programs as possible for anyone that's currently, in the process of getting educated. So yeah, I would say that it can be. I think most of it I learned on the job as well, in terms of just knowing the right questions to ask, but also just trying to understand what is the type of change that I want to have. Do I want to protect forests? Do I want more money for forests, right? There's so many different intervention points. So just being very laser focused on the type of impact that you want allows you then to reverse engineer and work backwards and determine what is the science, or help even inform the science that gets produced. Because then you could say, look, it would be really great if we knew, if we had science on residual emissions and offsets, and whether or not offsets are compatible with net zero, because then I can design a market around it. So then just also making sure that there's a feedback loop with the science is also really important. So yeah, I would say a mix of training and learning on the job.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing from you is that a lot of it is you deciding that that's in scope of what you want to do. You want to influence those decisions. And I think too often scientists sort of leave off at the scientific finding, and they sort of assume someone else is going to pick that up. But it's within your power to do that if you put forth effort.
I think people are listening. Hopefully people are listening to that, Steve. So again, I want to make sure everybody's questions with each other. You can ask them. I've got a few more here from the group, but anything?
Yeah, thank you for those answers. That's really helpful as a student looking to go into this area. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and ask about something you mentioned in your talk surrounding the language that's used in these commitments, and specifically at COP. The one that I heard about was the watering down of the language surrounding fossil fuels and coal from phase out to phase down, and how some of the smaller island nations like the Maldives that you were talking about, you represented, were very upset at this language change, and that there may be some power dynamics at play of countries who, like you said, want kind of more leverage and not necessarily being committed to the total phasing out of fossil fuels, because maybe they're also a developing nation and they want to give their people access to electricity. So I was just wondering your opinions on that, and language specifically in these agreements and these COPs, and if you think that we're moving in the right direction with that, or if you think it's still, like the fact that the word fossil fuels wasn't even mentioned until very recently in COPs, like if we can't even agree on that aspect of it, how do we move forward with this?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I think language is so important in these negotiations because, ultimately these are legal documents, even though they're not, technically legally binding in terms of enforcement mechanisms. And the Paris Agreement is legally binding, but what countries are doing is self-determined, right? So there's flexibility within what an actual country ends up committing to at the end of the day. In terms of the language, I will say that it was important for large developing countries to maintain that sense of respect in the process. I neglected to mention, but the United States was nearly absent for 4 years in these negotiations. There was a complete void of leadership. And there's still a process of the United States regaining that trust diplomatically. So I think that to expect that immediately once the Biden administration came back to these negotiations that we would revert back to, kumbaya is unrealistic. So there still, I think, is going to be time. There's still going to need to be a lot of political will and goodwill that's built in the system. But most importantly, it's the financing. I think these developing countries needed to maintain that leverage to be able to demand and make sure that developed countries make good on. So developed countries actually in Copenhagen made $100 billion per annual commitment to developing countries to finance climate mitigation and adaptation, but they have not met that commitment. It's only about 70, 80 billion at most, even till today, on an annual basis, and a lot of that is concessional loan financing. So there needed to still be, I think, developing countries needed to maintain a bit of the control in the process to hold developed countries accountable. So I would read it as just that. Of course, it's disappointing. I think there needs to be economy-wide acknowledgement of the need to completely decarbonize our economy. I think there's acceptance of that goal, but I still think that there needs to be more given by way of policy and finance and technology transfer for that to actually be realized in practice.
Thanks so much. A few other questions. So here's one. I'm going to change gears just a little bit because we got a couple of questions about this, and it was really around technology around carbon sinks. So you talked about sort of natural carbon sinks. What are your thoughts, or are there discussions of the role of technology in creating more opportunities for capturing carbon dioxide? What do you think that role is in some kind of global footprint?
Yeah. You all probably also have some really good thoughts about this, but I will just say that there's, I think, a little bit of a fear in the conservation space about techno-optimism and this idea that we can engineer our way out of the problem, out of climate change, and especially because we are losing forests at an unprecedented rate, especially during the pandemic. Deforestation rates have gone up. So I think that there has been a fear that there would have been a license to continue to degrade and destroy our environment with the hope of technology that would just extract or eliminate all of those emissions in the future. So I think that our position and my position is that yes, down the line we will need some sort of technological engineered solution to remove carbon from the atmosphere, but right now our best hope of doing that is restoration. It's repairing and restoring degraded natural ecosystems. It's allowing natural ecosystems to regenerate and regrow. There's very easy, cheap, cost-effective ways of doing that. It's about releasing land from agricultural production, and in particular recognizing the land footprint for meat production and reducing meat consumption. There's a lot of ways that we can continue to steward our planet more effectively that don't require technological solutions. Again, that's not to dismiss the importance of carbon dioxide removal technologies, which I very much believe are needed but are not a replacement for maintaining the natural carbon sink.
Yeah, I think if I think about it with entropy, it's easier to not spill the milk than to clean it up after you spilled it at some level. I don't know, Steve, or Julianne, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great distinction, and I completely agree with you. I think that people kind of painting maybe these more technological solutions or these technological ways of removing carbon from the atmosphere, and that fear surrounding it come from the fact that, then maybe we could just keep doing business as usual and offset it with these negative emissions technologies. And I agree with you. I don't think that that's the way forward. I do think that conservation and doing everything we can in our power to mitigate and to remove CO2 from the atmosphere naturally is the best solution. But there still we can get 80-90% of the way there, and there are still going to be some sectors that are particularly difficult to decarbonize, that for that technological carbon removal will probably have its place and be needed. So I think that that's a really important distinction, that we need solutions on all fronts. There's no one thing that is going to necessarily be the answer to decarbonization in every sector and in every aspect. Want to add to that, Steve?
No, I think you said it very well. Yeah, there's this emerging phrase, instead of a silver bullet, it's silver buckshot. We need a lot of different solutions. Yeah. But I agree with what Julianne said. I think there is this idea that we can just use technology to buy our way out of things and not have to change our behaviors. And I think that's makes sense to a point. I think there's going the other way. There's people who maybe almost have this instinct that we really want to penalize people in terms of their personal behavior rather than look to technology to solve our problems. So there's some balance to be had there, I guess.
Something that I think hasn't come up yet, but I'm sure the three of you and probably many in the audience think a lot about, is the overlap between sort of our concerns about the climate, but also the mitigating effects, sort of health impacts of the, for example, some of the most polluting plants, and then racial justice, which sort of, I think there's sort of this Venn diagram that all of these things overlap. Maybe I'll start with you, Steve, because I know you just published a paper on the health impacts of shutting down some of the dirtiest, most polluting plants. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, and then thoughts on the overlap between health and climate.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic right now. I'm really pleased to see the trend in thinking about equity on all different time scales and spatial scales in a more robust way. The paper you mentioned, we looked at, to get to a given climate target, we know we need to phase out a lot of our fossil fuels, but it actually really matters how we do that. If you close down the power plants that also emit the most air pollution, you get to the same climate target, but you save literally millions more lives by the middle of the century. So our paper was kind of making that case, demonstrating where those gains are to be had, and we actually looked at individual power plants, and we can tell you, within a country, which power plant is the worst and which one needs to close first. So trying to get to that very actionable information for decision makers that hopefully will read the Nature Climate Change paper.
The deforestation-related health, there's also a lot of research that has shown that deforestation increases the risk of spillover. So especially if we're looking for pandemic prevention, there's another reason of the multitude of reasons that we have to protect forests and natural ecosystems.
Yeah. Okay, any other comments or thoughts on that subject from the audience? Any experts here? Okay. All right, so let's go to this. I mean, this is more from the beginning with this. I had a lot of questions about this. I might as well ask it. What are the projected effects that climate change would have on this planet and human flourishing? I mean, I know we don't know exactly, but where do we really know over the next, say, 20, 30 years if it's business as usual, if we don't get to 2 degrees? Do we have a sense of the direction things are going, and what does that really mean for the planet? I know it's not an easy question to answer. But
yeah, that's a super tough one because it's so broad in its scope. Shyla mentioned some really good ones early on, and I think the point that I liked that you made in your presentation, Shyla, was that we've actually probably been underestimating the impacts. Not only did we think a lot of the impacts of climate change were going to be far in the future, but if you look at what we thought was going to happen now, we actually missed the mark. We were seeing more impacts on a lot of systems than we expected. And that really comes to pass with things like extreme weather events and the wildfires that Shyla mentioned that seem to be getting much worse than we thought much earlier. Sea level rise in the longer term is going to be an issue, and there's a huge error bar on that. We don't know exactly when, but we know it's going to be a lot if we keep going at the warming rate that we have been. And so that's a big fear since so much of the global population lives along coasts. Agriculture, Shyla mentioned also, we're not probably going to see a collapse of our food systems, but it's a headwind. So whereas historically we've made a lot of progress in increasing the yields from our different agricultural systems, we're going to have this headwind of climate change to fight against, and it's going to be a challenge to maintain these systems and preserve nature as the population becomes larger and more affluent. And so I think those are kind of the main things in my mind. I'm sure these guys have other ones.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of echo what Steve was saying about that there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding this still, and so it's kind of a call to action for continued research into the science of our climate and understanding these mechanisms better, in addition to all the work that people are doing on the policy and the solutions side, is mostly what I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, maybe the only thing to add is that we've been talking a lot in conservation about tipping points, so kind of points of no return. So it's largely kind of accepted within the Amazon that if you lose any more than 20% of the Amazon, then it will reach a tipping point and basically lead to a feedback loop where the Amazon rainforest would turn into a savanna because of all of how arid it would be and all of the kind of the increased rates of fires. There's also albedo effect, so the more ice that melts, the darker surfaces are exposed, which then absorbs more heat and which warms the planet further. So you kind of also have these feedback loops that cause more warming. Same thing with fires. Fires burn vegetation, which causes more carbon emissions. So then that again is another feedback loop. So there's an active discussion about have we reached tipping points in these different domains of the biosphere and different planetary boundaries, and we've exceeded some of them, we've maintained some of them, but more reason to accelerate conservation and make sure that we're adapting and preventing these impacts from getting worse.
Thanks. Okay, everyone. Well, I think this would be a good time for me to thank our speakers. Thank you so much. I'm going to just flip through these slides as I'm talking. Thank you so much, Shyla, Steve, and Julianne. It was great to have you here. I think we all very much appreciated this conversation. I wanted to let everybody know that we have another one of these, I hope, interesting solutions that scale seminars that's going to be coming up on December 16th, where we have Sona Coffey from the City of Irvine's Public Works and Transportation Department. She's going to tell us about Irvine's participation in the Cool City Challenge and the carbon neutral ambition that we have as a city to move in that positive direction. Shyla, I want to sort of say to you that you are always welcome back if you want to attend any of these meetings in the future. Unfortunately, now I have your email address. I'm going to be bugging you all the time, so sorry about that. Until you put me in the spam folder, you better look out. So, but anyway, thanks to everybody who came, and I know I enjoyed it. So, and we have some lunch out in the patio for people who want to stay for lunch. Please join us out there. Okay, thanks everybody.